At the mall, a little boy approaches a billionaire SE and says, "Hey sir, this picture of my mom fell out of your pocket." Pocket the man freezes instantly, amazed by what he just. The mall was buzzing with Christmas cheer, twinkling lights hung like stars. Across the vaulted ceilings, their glow danced joyfully in the glossy storefront windows. The delightful sound of carolers singing decked the halls filled the air, beautifully blending with the cheerful jingle of Salvation Army bells and the muffled hum of 1,000 conversations. Families joyfully bustled through the crowds, arms laden with bags, faces beaming. Flushed from the warmth inside and the winter chill beyond the glass doors, children chattered excitedly. Dragging. Parents were excitedly pointing out toy store displays and Santa's workshop, but Edward Holt was blissfully unaware as he strolled through the mall with purpose, his polished shoes clicking confidently against the tile floors. He was dressed to impress for the scene, sporting a tailored charcoal suit, a black wool coat, and a silk scarf tied neatly at his neck. His phone was pressed to his ear, his voice low and sharp as he confidently gave clear instructions to someone on the other end. On the other end, I expressed my desire to have those numbers finalized tonight. Let's focus on getting it done without any excuses. It's Christmas Eve, a time to embrace joy and creativity, not an excuse to overlook deadlines. As he spoke, he wove a tapestry of inspiration. Through the crowd, eyes fixed ahead, sidestepping last-minute shoppers and kids with sticky candy cane hands. Edward navigated with a sense of purpose. Holt moved through the festive chaos like an outsider, his expression carved from stone, yet there was a sense of wonder in the air around him. Glanced at him as he passed, noticing the commanding presence of a man who seemed to stand out in this setting, yet he paid no mind. A toddler bumped into his leg and toppled over, letting out a wail. Edward stopped briefly, glancing down with surprise. Despite the discomfort, he offered a sincere, albeit stiff, apology to the frazzled mother before moving on. His mind filled with possibilities. Where he stood already focused on continuing meetings and profit margins, Edward Holt was a man who made the most of every moment. But it seemed that time had other plans for him, sir. Hey, sir. The small voice resonated through the home of the M like a bell ringing a clear, pure note, and Edward barely took notice of it. Initially drawn away by his call and the lively mix of sounds surrounding him, sir, the voice was louder this time, insistent. And Edward felt a gentle tug at his coat sleeve. With a sudden clarity, he halted mid-stride, a thoughtful frown crossing his face as he looked down at a small figure now stands before him. A boy no older than 7 or 8, with a delightful mop of brown hair sticking out in all directions. From under a knit beanie, the child's cheeks were flushed pink, either from excitement or the cold, and his blue eyes sparkled with joy. Were wide as they gazed up at Edward, who was pleasantly surprised to discover he found himself face to face with the child. Hey, sir, this picture of my mom fell out of your pocket. Edward blinked at my pocket. His first instinct was to give the boy another chance. It could be a misunderstanding or just a child confusing him for someone else, but then he noticed. What the boy held in his outstretched hand was a small crumpled photograph. The world appeared to shift a little and Edward paused, the lively chatter surrounding him gradually fading into a gentle hum. In the back of his mind, his gaze fell on the photos. And even from that brief moment, he had a feeling he knew exactly what it was, what she looked like. No, it couldn't be. He was filled with a sense of wonder, glanced quickly at the boy and then back to the photograph, hopeful that the illusion might dissolve, but it remained steadfast. The edges had a charming bend, and the image carried a gentle wear, suggesting it had been cherished through countless moments of folding and unfolding. It was clear with the lovely soft brown hair that cascaded past her shoulders, the way her eyes always sparkled with joy even when her mouth didn't. Smile small but radiant, it was Amelia, who he hadn't seen in a while. Decade Amelia, whose absence still lingered in his life like a shadow in the corner of a room. Always present, but Edward's heart raced in his chest, filled with a new and exciting sensation. As it spread through him, he noticed the boy watching him with eager anticipation, holding the photograph higher, as if Edward. It's possible I overlooked it the first time, but that's my mom, the boy said with pride. Fell out of your coat. Saw Edward's throat, felt a bit dry. And he looked sharply at the boy, searching for any hint, any connection, any reason that could illuminate this extraordinary moment I'm experiencing. Apologies, kid. What was that? Edward's voice came out a bit rough and unsteady, quite noticeable. In contrast to the Polish tone he normally carried, the boy grinned, misinterpreting Edward's bewilderment as, "There's a bit of confusion with this picture. It was right behind you, and it must have fallen when you, as you walked by, you dropped it." And he waved it slightly for emphasis, along with Edward, flinched as if the movement might reveal something precious. Edward's gaze danced across the ground around him as if, looking for signs that he might have unknowingly carried it, but there was nothing. He hadn't lost a photograph. He hadn't even thought about Amelia in months, no years. He told himself, so where could she be? With great anticipation, Edward gently reached for the photograph. His hands quivered with excitement as his fingers gently touched the worn paper, and he took it from the boy. It felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the weight of memories Edward had buried long ago. His eyes sparkled with a sense of wonder. The image for only a moment, just long enough for the ache in his chest to deepen. "Where did you get this?" he asked, softly. His voice barely rose above the clamor surrounding them. The boy frowned, intrigued by the question I posed. "It slipped out of your pocket." Edward smiled gently and said, "No, that's not quite right." It's possible he found himself captivated by the photograph again, eagerly searching for something, anything that might reveal itself. It's interesting to think about why this child, had a picture of Amelia, who happens to be my mom. The boy remarked with a hint of pride softening his voice. "Isn't she lovely?" Edward couldn't respond. His mouth felt dry, and his words seemed to be waiting for the perfect moment to emerge. His mind raced with possibilities, and the weight in his chest felt like a reminder of the exciting changes ahead. The boy tilted his head, ready to embrace whatever came next. Studying Edward with curiosity. "Do you know her? You look amusing." Edward blinked. His gaze snapped back to the boy's face, and a sudden, unexpected surge of excitement flared inside him. "Do you know her?" The question resonated in his mind like a rhythmic drumbeat. Had he truly known Amelia at all? "I'm sorry," Edward muttered, with a slightly shaky voice. I believe there might have been a misunderstanding as he returned the photograph toward the boy, but his hand lingered, almost as if it didn't want to let go of the boy's. Smile brightened as if he was open to the possibilities of this moment, something special, something inviting. "And I have to go," Edward interrupted him. The words came out more pointed than he meant them to be. Turned abruptly, shoving his phone back to his ear as though it could anchor him to reality. "Wait," the boy called after him. Edward continued on, quickening his pace as his polished shoes clicked rhythmically against the tiles, his hand gripping the phone. And even though he wasn't speaking, his heart was full of hope. With determination in his heart, he pounded his chest, feeling the excitement of the unknown ahead. He may not have known the destination, but he was ready to embrace the journey. As he disappeared into the crowd, the boy stood there, the photograph clutched in his small hands, gazing with hope. After Edward with a thoughtful frown as though piecing together a puzzle that was just waiting to reveal its solution. Distance, the carolers sang the final line of "Deck the Halls." And somewhere buried beneath Edward Holt's finely tailored coat and carefully constructed life, something cracked, but Edward kept moving, his footsteps echoing sharply in his ears. A unique melody contrasting with the festive hum around him. The photograph of the boy and Amelia was a string of delightful memories. Unbelievable coincidences, and yet his heart raced with excitement, as if eager to reveal some hidden truth. Back into his mind, his phone still clutched tightly in his hand, was waiting in silence. At one point, the call dropped, but Edward was blissfully unaware. And for once, everything felt just right. He confidently navigated through the crowds, choosing to focus ahead and embrace the journey, leaving families behind him. Couples and clusters of joyful strangers. Every smiling face radiated a sense of warmth, in a delightful contrast to the storm inside him. He paused near an enormous Christmas tree in the mall's atrium, which soared up toward the sky. The skylight, adorned with shimmering lights and ornaments, stands as a vibrant centerpiece of holiday cheer. Edward stood there breathing hard, his hand shaking just enough for him to notice, but he felt a spark of determination within him. "It's simply a mistake," he reassured himself, a curious coincidence that the boy remains unaware of. Anything, and yet the moment played in his mind on an endless loop. The little boy so innocent holding up that photograph as if it were a wonderful gift from my mom. The thought filled Edward with joy. It's surprising to think about how this child managed to get a photo of Amelia. He whispered to himself, tugging the scarf tighter around his neck with a sense of determination. As he sought to steady himself, his gaze eagerly swept through the crowd behind him, searching for the boy. There he was. The little boy stood exactly where Edward had left him by the railing near Santa's workshop, filled with excitement, still holding the photograph. Turning it over in his small hands as if it held a delightful mystery waiting to be uncovered, his face was creased with a frown. The kind of determined spirit children show when they encounter something puzzling. Edward experienced a sudden wave of guilt for having walked away. The boy truly deserved better, being just a child. Yet Edward, he couldn't return, and he found it challenging to articulate something that was beyond his own understanding. The past was like a locked door in his mind, one he had secured years ago. But the possibilities of what lies ahead are bright and full of hope. Wasn't meant to creak open walk away. He believed he could just walk away, and yet before he could convince himself otherwise, Edward found that his legs were hesitant to move, himself retracing his steps, his heart growing more determined with every footfall until he stopped a few feet from the boy who, still unaware of his return, Edward cleared his throat softly, and the child's head shot up, a bright smile lighting up his face. It felt like everything fell into place again with Edward's return. "Hey, you came back." Edward made an effort to soften his expression, even though he wasn't sure he succeeded. "Listen, kid," he gestured with a bit of stiffness. "Regarding the photograph, I believe there's been a little mix-up. That one isn't mine." The boy tilted. His head tilted with curiosity as he held the photo up again, "But it was right behind you on the ground. And that's my mom." He pointed to the image with one finger, so confident and sure. Trusting Edward encouraged himself to look, and it was just as challenging the second time. Amelia's smile radiated back at him, so familiar and filled with warmth. It was a younger version of her. Perhaps 25 or 26, a time full of promise. Life had shaped her features, yet she appeared joyful, just as Edward remembered her during those times when he still believed in the world can be so simple when love feels like enough, even if just for a fleeting second. I considered taking the photograph back. Is it mine? Did I misplace it in some way? But no, that was just not feasible. He didn't hold on to old photographs. He didn't grasp at them. Ghosts. His voice emerged with a surprising strength, more powerful than he had meant it to be. "It isn't mine. You might have confused it with someone else's." The boy gazed at him for a moment, his small brow furrowing like he was working on a puzzle, and as he held the photo tighter, a sense of clarity began to emerge. Edward exhaled sharply, his pulse quickening. "Kid, I'm telling you." "Do you know her?" The boy interrupted. His voice was small yet steadfast. "You looked. It's amusing how, when you saw it, you felt like you knew her." Edward was taken aback. The words seemed to strike him deeply. Unsettling in their honesty, he took a deep breath, determined to embrace the unexpected shift. "I haven't seen her before." It wasn't entirely untrue that he hadn't seen this version of her before, the one captured in the boy's photograph. The boy's shoulders lifted slightly as he glanced, looking at the picture. His expression was uncertain, but he gently remarked, "You seem a bit sad." Edward felt a tightening in his throat, sensing that this was a moment of change that could lead to a positive resolution. An unusual twist the universe had orchestrated for him tonight. Whatever coincidence had brought Amelia's spirit back to him as a photograph and a child, a mystery waiting to be explored. "Look, Edward took a step back, his voice more steady now, maintaining a careful neutrality. "Merry Christmas, kid." The boy's eyes brightened quickly, searching Edward's face one last time. He searched through time, hoping to uncover an answer, but his expression showed a hint of disappointment as his small hands explored, gripping the photograph tighter. "Oh, okay. Merry Christmas, sir." The words filled the air with warmth. Something deep in Edward's chest stirred, but he brushed it aside with a curt nod as he turned. He moved forward, determined to keep his eyes ahead. As the mall embraced him once more, the lights shone brightly, and the cheers filled the air with energy. Edward tucked his hands deep into his coat pockets and he moved toward the exit. His breath tight and shallow, but that doesn't mean anything. Anything he told himself about the photo of the boy is just a fluke. But that wasn't true. And he felt a spark of realization as the automatic doors slid open, letting in a gust of icy air swept by as Edward glanced over his shoulder one last time. He could just. It's a challenge to spot the boy among the bustling crowd. Yet there he is, standing proudly by the railing with the photograph held close to his heart. Edward turned his gaze back to the snow-dusted parking lot, which stretched before him like a blank page, inviting and full of potential. He didn't look back again. The drive home was a blur, but Edward sat with a sense of determination. In the back of his town car, his jaw clenched as the world rushed past the window. He kept reminding himself that everything would be all right. It didn't matter that Amelia was just a part of his past, as distant as a dream he'd woken up from long ago, because the photograph lingered in his thoughts, her face, that smile. The boy he harmed, hand through his hair, a spark of determination igniting within him. It's a challenge waiting to be conquered, he murmured, gazing at the snowflakes dancing against the dark sky as the car gently came to a stop in front of him. Penthouse building. Edward stepped out quietly, passing by the doorman's cheerful greeting as he walked inside. In the serene stillness of the elevator, Edward leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. He could still envision the photograph as vividly as if it were right in front of him, Amelia's face shining brightly. Eyes and the boy's voice echoing in his head. "That's my mom. Do you know her?" Edward opened his eyes, gazing at his own reflection in the polished doors. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing Edward with a sense of anticipation. Into the muted luxury of his penthouse, the space was pristine, inviting a sense of potential and possibility. A stunning expanse of marble floors, sleek furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows framing the glittering city skyline. The silence inside was striking, only interrupted by the gentle hum of the heating system and the sound of Edward's footsteps as he walked to in this study. He cheerfully dropped his keys onto the polished desk with a bright clink and sank into the leather chair, elbows braced on the armrests, with his knees drawn up and his hands covering his face. He remained in that position for a while, taking deep breaths, challenging as if the act of moving through his day had taken every bit of his energy. The photograph, the boy's words, played on a loop in his mind. "That's my mom." Edward sat up. He paused for a moment and rubbed his face with both hands. He was determined not to let this unravel him. It was surprising he didn't embrace the ideas of fate, chance, or the echoes of the past. Returning at Christmas time, he embraced the power of logic to manage the things within his control. He opened his laptop with determination and tried to focus on work. As he brought up a spreadsheet he'd planned to finish that evening, his inbox pinged with a flurry of emails, each one a new opportunity waiting to be addressed. Reminders about meeting numbers that need reviewing and a client presentation that his team was eagerly anticipating for Edward himself to focus. But the letters and numbers danced together on the screen. Amelia, her name surfaced in his thoughts unbidden like the echo of a melody he hadn't heard in years. Edward smiled and he pushed away from the desk, standing abruptly. His office felt a bit cramped, but that just means there's room for new possibilities. He crossed to the window and gazed out at the city below, where twinkling lights stretched as far as the horizon. Horizon filled with countless lives dancing through the night, somewhere out there. Elia, there's a chance he may have turned away from the view and returned to his. With a deep breath, Edward reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out his wallet, feeling a moment of anticipation. Just a brief pause before revealing a small, cherished photograph that had seen better days. The edges had a charming fray, and the image held a gentle fade. But it was unmistakable. It was the same photograph the little boy had held up that evening, the same face that had lingered in his thoughts for years. Amelia. Edward sank back into his chair. The photograph resting on his palm, he gazed at it for a long time, his expression a delightful mystery. She looked so young, her face radiant with hope and joy. This had been taken during their college years, just before everything transformed. His fingers traced the edge of the photo, bringing back the cherished memories. Came unexpectedly, flowing over him like a tide they encountered during their first year at university. Edward had always been ambitious, with a sharp tone and a determined spirit, natural charisma that attracted people to him. Amelia, on the other hand, was his opposite, soft-spoken but fiercely determined, intelligent with a kindness that brightened the world around her. Edward, he could still recall the first time he saw her. She had been sitting on the campus lawn beneath a sprawling oak tree, a book in her hands. In her lap, sunlight filtered through the branches, dancing across her face. She smiled as he approached, a genuine smile that completely disarmed him. He spent the rest of that afternoon beside her, Pretending to read while stealing glances at her from the corner of his eye, their friendship blossomed. Turned to something deeper before long they spent nights studying together in the library, sharing whispers between them. When the librarian glared at them, he'd happily walk her home through the peaceful streets of their small college, town hands tucked into his pocket, playfully ignoring the moment when their fingers lightly touched. Amelia had visions of teaching, of traveling, of creating a life that transcends money or success. Edward's visions, though he dreamed of greatness. He aimed to build empires and leave a lasting legacy. People would talk about him long after he was gone. "You're going to change the world someday," Amelia had told him. As they sat beneath the same oak tree at night, her head resting against his shoulder, Edward chuckled softly, filled with warmth. "If you're in it with me," she looked up at him, her eyes brimming with love. That it made his chest ache, she whispered, but always felt like a fleeting moment. As graduation approached, Edward found himself filled with excitement and anticipation. With great ambition, he dedicated his days to pursuing opportunities and connecting with individuals he believed could assist him in reaching new heights. Amelia made an effort to keep up at first, but he noticed how the late nights he didn't come home began to take a toll on her. Phone calls that went unanswered. The quiet dinners where neither of them said much at all. "There's an opportunity to rediscover yourself, Edward," she had said to him one night, her voice filled with emotion as she stood by the door with her coat in her hand. "And Edward had said nothing about losing me. A part of him believed she would come back, that she would see in time why he had to work so hard and why it all mattered. But she didn't win. She walked out that door. Edward let her go, convincing himself it was for the best. Love was a distraction, and he, focused and determined. Years flew by, and Edward accomplished all that he had dreamed of. Success, wealth, and power are within reach. Yet he always held on to that photograph, stayed in his wallet tucked behind credit cards and crisp bills, a cherished reminder of the life he'd embraced. Edward blinked back to the present, his gaze joyfully fixed on Amelia's face. For years, he convinced himself that she was a part of his past, a chapter he'd closed long ago. But now that little boy Charlie brings a spark of hope and possibility. Had torn those pages wide open. The boy's voice resonated in Edward's mind. "That's my mom. Do you think she could be out there? Is it possible that Amelia is still around?" That she had a son brought a sense of warmth to Edward's heart at the thought of a son of his own. Thoughts raced with excitement, grasping at fragments of logic that were just waiting to come together. If Charlie was Amelia's son, what a fascinating revelation that would be. Did that mean how could it be? And then another question emerged, waiting to be voiced. But could he be mine? Edward's breath caught at the thought, his grip tightening on the photograph. It was surprising he hadn't seen Amelia in over a decade, but the boy, with his wide blue eyes and that small but insistent voice, was truly something special. There was something about him that Edward couldn't shake. The office felt a bit cooler now, and the silence seemed to hold a certain promise. Heavier. Edward ran a hand through his hair, letting out a deep breath as he gazed at the photograph in his hand. "What did you do with your life, Amelia?" he whispered. It was a question for her, but Edward sat there for hours, surrounded by the city lights stretching endlessly before him, endlessly beyond the windows. The photograph still resting in his palm, he felt a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore now. Imagine it didn't matter that Amelia was out there somewhere, and perhaps, just perhaps, everything will turn out wonderfully. There was a child who shared his blood, and for the first time in years, Edward Holt felt a spark of hope. A man who always had a plan and always had the answers found himself feeling a bit lost at the mall. Grew quieter as the evening wound down, the crowds thinned, and the carolers packed up with smiles. As they gathered their songbooks, the stores began to softly dim their lights, creating a cozy atmosphere at the edge of the vibrant food scene. Amelia sat across from Charlie at a small, slightly wobbly table, feeling a sense of anticipation. Watched him finish the last of his hot chocolate, his nose dusted with whipped cream and his face glowing from. With a sense of anticipation and a hint of coolness in the air, she eagerly asked, "So, tell me again what happened?" A teasing smile tugged at her lips as Charlie looked up, his blue eyes sparkling with excitement. "I told you, Mom. I saw him. When I dropped this picture and handed it back." He had the funniest expression on his face. Charlie's little brows scrunched together as he eagerly searched for the right words, as if he had just encountered something surprising and exciting. Amelia chuckled softly, shaking her head with a smile as she took a sip of her coffee. A ghost. Oh, well, not exactly a ghost, Charlie quickly clarified as he pulled the now slightly crinkled photograph from his jacket pocket and held it up between his fingers, and when he saw this, he felt a rush of warmth. Calm and unusual. I believe he understands you, Mom. Amelia paused, her smile slightly wavering. Just a little as she caught sight of the photograph she hadn't seen in years. It was an old picture, one taken during her college days when her whole world felt vibrant and uncomplicated. Edward had. She captured that photo of her one summer afternoon, recalling the delightful moment when she caught her off guard as she sat under an oak tree, smiling at something he'd said while she playfully insisted she wasn't ready and her hair looked awful. But when she saw it later, she couldn't help but smile. He had always had a way of brightening her day, capturing her, seeing her in a way no one else did. The memory filled her heart with warmth. Just for a moment, before she tucked it away again, she said gently, "I love you, sweetheart. I believe there might have been a mix-up." Perhaps it wasn't his picture after all, Charlie. He shook his head, clearly determined. No way. He had that look, like he recognized you from somewhere, even though he didn't say a word. But I could sense Amelia's laughter, a gentle sound that held a touch of joy. It's amazing how people can resemble others we know. It happens all the time. Charlie pouted, his little hands still gripping the photograph tightly, but there must be a reason for his sadness. Then he looked. It was a tough moment for Mom, and he could really use a comforting hug. Amelia reached out and he smoothed his hair, her smile softening. Perhaps he was simply having a challenging day. Holidays can be challenging for some individuals, even if they don't express it. Charlie appeared contemplative for a moment, his small shoulders lifting in a shrug. I believe he could really use a Christmas friend. Amelia blinked, delighted by the innocence and purity of his words. A Christmas friend. Absolutely. Charlie nodded with enthusiasm, emphasizing that Christmas is all about helping people feel good. It's wonderful to feel loved and not alone. That man seemed quite alone, but I'm hopeful he'll return. And if he does, I'm excited to tell him he can be my Christmas friend. Amelia felt something warm and hopeful in her. Just a warmth mingled with an old ache. Her son had always been like this, so pure, with a heart eager to care for others. It was one of the things she cherished most about him, even when it occasionally brought her pain. With warmth, she reached across the table and gently took his small hand in hers. "Charlie, you have such a big heart," she said softly, "and I believe there's still hope he might come." Regardless of who he was, he likely didn't even recall the picture of Charlie's lips. Purston thought once more, "I believe he had an inkling, you know." Amelia smiled softly, a glimmer of hope in her expression. Her eyes looked distant now. "Well, sweetheart, if he did, I'm sure it's just someone from a long time ago. People grow and change. Oh, that's just how life works." Charlie stared at her, his young face full of curiosity. Amidst the confusion, "You still held on to the memory of Dad," and the words lingered in the air. A moment that felt both soft and substantial, and Ai's smile wavered slightly as she offered his hand a tender touch. "No, I didn't," she said quietly, "but that's okay. Some people are just always. A part of us remains, even when they're not here anymore." Charlie nodded, showing he grasped the essence. "But perhaps we could have brought him some joy." Amelia reflected on this. For a long moment, her heart swelled with pride and an indescribable feeling. She reached out and brushed her thumb across his cheek, smoothing away a smudge of whipped cream. "You're a good kid, Charlie," she said. Gently, you realized that Charlie radiated joy in the photograph. Momentarily set aside, he enjoyed the last sips of his hot chocolate while Amelia relaxed in her chair, observing him with a reflective look. Appreciating all her attempts to find humor in the situation with Charlie. Described lingered in her mind a man who appeared as if he had encountered something extraordinary. She shook her head slightly, brushing off the thought. It seemed unlikely. She hadn't seen Edward Holt in years, hadn't heard from him, and hadn't looked for him, whatever part of her life he was in. She was ready for new adventures. Occupied had been buried long ago, left in the dust of ambition and broken promises, and yet as she watched Charlie, a spark of hope ignited within her. Swing his feet under the table, the thought lingered, unwelcome yet persistent. What if Amelia glanced at the clock hanging above the food court, gently reminding her to embrace the moment? "Come on, kiddo," she said, standing and wrapping her coat around her shoulders with a smile. It's getting late. We should head home. Charlie slid out of his chair and tucked the photograph back into his jacket pocket, keeping it safe as though it were a treasure. Amelia smiled and shook her head. With a warm smile, she took his hand, and together they happily made their way toward the mall exit. The sounds of holiday cheers continued to resonate around them, while the night remains calm. The snow fell gently, dusting the cars and sidewalks in a soft white layer, creating a serene and peaceful atmosphere in the world around. Soft snow and the lateness of the hour, Charlie skipped ahead a few steps, his boots crunching through the fresh snow. Fell gently as he hummed a cheerful Christmas song under his breath, and Amelia watched him with a smile, fondly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Embracing the challenges of long hours and the journey of making ends meet, Christmas had always been her favorite time of year. And even though it had become more challenging since Charlie's father passed, she still held on to the joy and magic of the season. She truly gave it her all, just as she always did. And as she gazed up at the dark sky, the snowflakes floated gently down. She allowed herself a brief moment to wonder where Edward Holt was tonight and if perhaps he was still on his journey of discovery. He had been all those years ago. Char's voice filled the silence as he turned back toward her, his grin wide. "Mom, do you?" Amelia smiled, pulling her coat tighter against the chilly air, believing that Santa's going to bring her something special this year. The chill in the air was no match for her warmth as she reached for his hand. It felt like she already had everything she could ever want. Charlie smiled knowingly, his small fingers gripping hers. "I bet he's—" Amelia laughed softly, shaking her head as they walked toward home, excited about bringing a Christmas friend along too. Footprints of prints trailed behind them in the snow as Edward found it hard to sleep that night. The city skyline shimmered with lights, stretching endlessly beyond the penthouse windows, but Edward was lost in thought as he sat at his desk. The photograph of Amelia remained in his hand, turning it over again and again, as if it might reveal the answers he sought. He focused intently, and the boy's voice lingered in his mind. "That's my mom," he thought, with a sense of warmth. As the first hint of dawn broke over the horizon, Edward was pacing, filled with anticipation as he tried to gently set it all aside, convincing himself it was not his concern. Yet the memory of Amelia's smile and the little boy it was etched into his mind, and while it seemed absurd, there was a persistent sense of curiosity, feeling that he couldn't shake. And yet as he stood there watching the snow drift gently across the city below, Edward understood that he had to return. The mall was buzzing with energy. Christmas cheer filled the air again the next day, bringing a kind of joy that Edward always found a bit overwhelming this time of year, as music played joyfully through unseen speakers. The delightful scent of cinnamon and fresh-baked pretzels filled the air, and families joyfully bustled through the decorated halls. Edward felt a bit out of place, like a splash of gray paint on a vibrant canvas. Festive canvas. He adjusted his coat and pushed forward, scanning the crowds with excitement. It was a bit naive, really. The boy could be anywhere. Or perhaps he's just exploring the unknown. He might even surprise us all. Come back, and yet Edward couldn't silence the quiet hope bubbling inside him. If I find the boy, maybe I can. He navigated through the mall's expansive levels, weaving past bustling storefronts with ease. Children with oversized stuffed animals, blissfully unaware of the curious glances from passing shoppers as he made his way. The center atrium, he was starting to feel uncertain about his decision to come, and then he spotted Charlie, the boy sitting on a bench near Santa's workshop, swinging his legs as he joyfully watched the line of children eagerly waiting to meet Santa Claus. The oversized red and white display, complete with a towering tree and animatronic reindeer, radiated a wonderful glow, the space making it look almost enchanting. Charlie, however, didn't seem captivated by it. The excitement was palpable as he gazed at something in his hands, a thoughtful frown on his face, the photograph of Edward. His chest tightened, and he hesitated, his feet refusing to move. What was he doing? What a moment to reflect. Did he hope to accomplish here? Then Charlie looked up, and Edward realized he had already been seen. Charlie's face was bright with anticipation. Brightened instantly. "Hey, you came back." Edward paused for just a moment, then approached slowly, hands tucked warmly in his coat pockets, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty in his throat. "Hi there." Charlie scooted to the side on the bench, making room. Without being asked, "Are you looking for me?" Edward sat, surprised at how effortlessly Charlie seemed to have his intentions in mind, as he quietly admitted he glanced at the photograph, still crumpled slightly in Charlie's small hand, is a cherished keepsake. "Absolutely," Charlie said with enthusiasm. "It's my favorite picture of Mom." Edward swallowed. His gaze softened as he looked at the boy up close. There was something about him, something familiar in the boy's blue eyes. Eyes sparkled with innocence, yet they carried a subtle strength that was truly remarkable. Edward expressed his desire to apologize for facing life's little hardships head-on. "Feeling a bit uneasy because I wasn't as kind to you yesterday," Charlie shrugged. It seemed insignificant. Yet Edward observed how he held the photograph with a bit more intensity. "All right, adults can have their off days," but Edward nearly smiled at that. "Isn't it delightful? What do you think happened?" Charlie nodded with assurance. "Yeah, you looked a bit down, so I thought maybe you just needed some time to feel better." Edward blinked, pleasantly surprised by the boy's simple, unassuming kindness. Studied Charlie for a moment, observing as the boy glanced back towards Santa's workshop with a dreamy look in his eyes sparkling with anticipation. Edward asked, gesturing toward the crowd of excited people. "Children?" Charlie shook his head and said no. "I already saw him yesterday, and I shared my thoughts with him." "What are your wishes for this year?" Edward asked with curiosity, turning to him. Charlie looked up, his face lighting up with a smile that tugged at Edward's heart in ways he didn't expect. "I asked him to make Mom happy for Christmas." Edward felt the words resonate with him, inspiring a sense of purpose. "Absolutely." Charlie swung his legs again, his shoes gently bumping against the bench. "Mom works really hard and sometimes she gets tired, but she believes we're fortunate nonetheless. Expresses that while some individuals may have very little, we should always embrace gratitude." Yet he trailed off, his little voice, now softer. "I just believe she deserves to be happy. That's what I shared with Santa." Edward's throat tightened as he listened, and he turned his gaze to the bustling crowd in front of them, unable to look at Charlie's earnest face. "Your mom seems like a wonderful person," he said softly. "The best." And Charlie replied without hesitation. He beamed, holding the photograph with pride. "She's truly wonderful and always lends a helping hand. Everyone, even when she's tired, she makes time for me. She says I'm her Christmas miracle." Edward felt a pang of joy. Deep in his chest, a hollow feeling stirred as he mustered the courage to ask the question he'd been holding on to. "I've been steering clear of his voice, which is softer now. What's your mom's name?" "Amelia?" Charlie said, looking up at Edward with a smile. "Do you know her?" The words sparkled with possibility. With a sudden jolt, Edward felt a rush in his chest, and for a brief moment, words escaped him as he turned toward Charlie, gently concealing the excitement brewing just below the surface eye. Edward took a moment to find the perfect words. "I once knew someone named Amelia a long time ago." "Not long ago." Charlie's eyes sparkled with curiosity. Perhaps it's the same. It would be great if Edward managed a small, quirky smile. Perhaps Charlie was blissfully unaware of his discomfort as he gazed back at Santa's workshop, his voice gently softening. "Once more, I truly believe she will get her wish." What wish did Edward ask about? He just couldn't help himself. Charlie shrugged. "Mom may not say it out loud, but I sense she hopes for someone special. To be her Christmas friend, you know. Someone who brings her joy and makes her smile. She's doing things for me, but I feel like she might not have anyone to do things for her." Edward felt a wonderful change inside him, like the warmth of spring breaking through a long winter. The boys' words, so pure and sincere, were like a mirror reflecting back all the beautiful things. Edward hadn't wanted to see Charlie hop off the bench. But suddenly he turned to face Edward with a bright smile. It's wonderful when you're feeling cheerful. Perhaps you could become her Christmas friend." Edward stared at the boy in amazement as he opened his mouth, but no words came out. Charlie, unaware of Edward's inner struggle, grinned again and grabbed the photograph, holding it up with excitement. "She'd like you, I think, and you'd like her, everyone." Edward took a small, shaky breath and managed to smile despite his thoughts. "We were racing. Do you think so?" "Yep," Charlie said. With a sense of assurance, Edward gazed at the photograph one last time. The image of Amy is smiling back at him, and felt his chest tightened, and he whispered, "Maybe you're right," feeling a sense of hope for the first time. For years, Edward Holt found himself in a place of uncertainty about what his next steps would be. Edward was unsure, but that only opened up a world of possibilities ahead of him. How it happened one moment, he was sitting on the bench near Santa's workshop, filled with wonder at everything around him. Charlie had said the next Charlie's small hand was wrapped tightly around his fingers, eagerly tugging him along with excitement. Surprising determination. "Come on, you have to meet her," Charlie said, his voice bubbling with excitement. Excitement filled the air as Edward stumbled over his own feet, his mind snapping back to the moment. "Just hang in there, kid. I have a feeling you might not be too fond of her, but I promise it will all work out," Charlie interrupted, turning back to flash Edward a grin. "And I just know she'll like you. Always says Christmas is full of surprises." Edward couldn't bring himself to argue. The boy's enthusiasm was a powerful influence of nature, and before he realized it, they were joyfully navigating through the bustling mall, surrounded by groups of families and enthusiastic shoppers, with their arms filled with bags. Edward's heart thudded in his chest with a rhythm he hadn't experienced in years. "What a feeling. Are you doing, Edward?" He couldn't stop, not now. They emerged into the food court, a vibrant space filled with people gathered at metal tables, eagerly shuffling through lines for coffee. Sandwiches and pretzels surrounded by the delightful hum of conversation filled the air, creating a vibrant atmosphere. Edward felt everything around him fade into a soft, distant hum, but then Charlie paused, and there she was. Edward paused, his breath momentarily held as he watched Charlie's outstretched hand. Amelia sat at a small table near the far end of the food court, a disposable coffee cup in her hands, feeling content. With her coat draped over the back of her chair, she was turned slightly away, gazing off into the distance, toward the holiday decorations that adorned the mall's center atrium. Unaware of their approach, Edward's feet felt light and eager. Like a guiding light, it was her, Amelia. Years had passed since he'd last seen her, but time had only enhanced the features he carried in his memory. Her hair, still the same warm brown, was swept into a loose style, but a few soft strands framing her face. There were gentle lines at the corners of her eyes, now held lines he didn't remember, etched there by smiles and worries he hadn't been part of, but she was still shining brightly. Amelia paused for a moment, and Charlie found himself breathless, turned back, gently tugging on Edward's hand to encourage him forward. "Come on, Mom." Edward stumbled another step, but his legs wouldn't carry him any further. He watched with hope as Charlie ran toward. Her little voice carried through the crowd. "Mom, Mom, I found him. He's here." Amelia turned at the sound of his voice, her brow slightly furrowed in curiosity, eager to discover who it was. She started to ask, but the words trailed off as her gaze lifted past Charlie and landed on Edward, and the world appeared to freeze. Her face brightened, the color shifting as if she were witnessing something extraordinary. Hands still clutching her coffee cup lowered slowly to the table. Edward couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He just stood there, taking it all in. Stood there, his heart racing with excitement as Amelia gazed at him with wide. For a long moment, with disbelieving eyes, neither of them said anything about the food. The court seemed to blur and quiet around them, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Finally, Amelia found. Her voice, though it trembled slightly, carried a sense of curiosity as she asked, "What are you doing here, Edward?" Words struck him unexpectedly, lacking warmth in her voice, filled only with shock and caution. By a wall of old hurt, he could almost see Edward. He took a step closer, feeling a sense of determination despite his dry throat. Amelia flinched slightly at hearing her name from his lips, her expression tightening. "I asked you a question. What are you doing here?" Edward hesitated, the words bubbling up with excitement as he glanced briefly at Charlie. Observed the exchange with a sense of innocent curiosity before turning back to Amelia. He realized it wasn't easy to convey that I was pleasantly surprised to see you here, he said finally, his voice a bit shaky. "I saw Charlie yesterday," and Amelia's eyes sparkled, flickered to her son who now stood beside her, looking between them with curiosity. Charlie, filled with joy, beamed proudly. "Absolutely, Mom. I mentioned him before. He's the one with the picture of you." Edward felt a twinge at the simplicity of Charlie's words, but Amelia's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as understanding blossomed. "Do you have a picture of me?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with curiosity. Now Edward paused, feeling the weight of the moment. "It's complicated," he said. "Is it?" Amelia responded, her voice still soft but filled with curiosity, but bubbling with emotion because it doesn't feel complicated, it feels like something I don't understand. Edward opened his mouth to respond, but Charlie jumped in before he could. Mom, don't be. I'm so glad he's really nice. He even came back today to meet you. Amelia looked down at her son, brought a gentle warmth to her expression before she turned back to Edward, the tension in her posture still noticeable, but with a hint of hope. What do you want, Edward? Edward's heart fluttered at her words, at the way she looked at him, as if he were a stranger who held endless possibilities. I felt out of place, unsure of my surroundings. He acknowledged it. His voice a bit rough, but there was a sense of honesty in his admission. I just didn't arrive at the right moment. I'm so excited to be looking for you. I had no idea you were here. But I spotted Charlie yesterday. He paused, looking at the boy he mentioned, sharing stories about his mom, Amelia. She straightened her chin, lifting it slightly, and you thought you'd come and play. The hero, her words stunning, but Edward didn't pull away. No, he said quietly, I just needed to find out what Amelia expressed with her voice full of emotion. Unspoken emotion filled the air as Edward hesitated, his gaze dancing between Charlie and back again. Is he? Amelia paused, the question lingering in the air between them for a while. The moment she gazed at Edward, her eyes exploring his face as if weighing her words, she finally nodded with a sense of clarity. Her head shook gently as she said, No, Charlie isn't yours. The words landed heavily, but there was a sense of clarity in the air. Edward hadn't prepared for it, but at the same time, Amelia's voice brought a strange, inexplicable relief. She softened her gaze as it fell to her son, who never had the chance to meet his father, Charlie, who passed away before he was born. He never got to meet him. Edward looked at the boy, his chest swelling with a mix of emotions at the innocence in his small face. I'm sorry, he murmured, uncertain about what he was apologizing for, his question, his presence. Or perhaps the past itself. Amelia exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly as the anger seemed to fade away, replaced by something more delicate and hopeful. Are you truly here, Edward? Edward's voice softened as he spoke more quietly now because I was pleasantly surprised to see you again, especially after noticing him holding that photograph, and He trailed off, shaking his head with a hint of curiosity. I don't know what I thought, Amelia. She observed him intently for a while, her expression a mystery, and then she finally turned to Charlie, her voice soft and warm. Sweetheart, can you give us a minute, Charlie? She paused, glancing between them, but Amelia beamed and encouraged. Go look at Santa's reindeer. I'll be right here. Okay, Charlie said, though he looked a bit hesitant to leave. He gave Edward a small, bright grin before dashing off toward the display. Edward watched him go, feeling a flutter of excitement in his chest. When he turned back to Amelia, her gaze was still on him, softer now, yet holding a hint of caution. I don't know why you came back, she said quietly, but Charlie isn't yours. Responsibility is something I cherish. He's my priority. I've dedicated years to creating a wonderful life for him. I appreciate your concern, but I believe I can handle this on my own. Turning it upside down, Edward nodded slowly, her words resonating with him. I understand. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Edward's voice broke the silence, low and sincere. He's a good kid. Amelia, you've done an incredible job. Amelia looked away, her eyes shimmering with emotion. I've done my best. Edward hesitated, his voice softer now. And are you happy? Amelia looked back at him, her expression a mix of emotions. I don't have time to think about that. Edward opened his. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was watch as Amelia turned toward where Charlie stood, her son's laughter ringing through the air, and in that moment, Edward realized just how much he had missed, and Edward stood near the food court table, his hands deep in his pockets, reflecting on the journey ahead. Coat pockets as Amelia turned back toward him, her expression a delightful mystery. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom, a new adventure ahead, and an opportunity to embrace the unknown. Like a man standing on thin ice. Amelia's words still lingered in the air. I don't need to worry. You showing up and turning it upside down, but Edward couldn't shake the look in Charlie's eyes, his kindness, his hope shining brightly. And the way Amelia had put in so much effort to conceal her own weariness, he'd noticed her, strengthened her pride, yet beneath it lay something else. something more subtle. Edward began with a gentle hesitation, feeling the weight of her request, yet hopeful despite the circumstances. Throughout these years, she raised an eyebrow, curious about what he would reveal as he exhaled slowly. With determination, he met her gaze and said, "I would love to invite you and Charlie to my home. Tomorrow, just for Christmas Eve dinner." Amelia looked at him with a sense of surprise, as if he had completely lost his way. "Consider Edward before you decline," he interrupted with a hopeful tone. "It's just a small dinner. No strings attached. I may not feel like I deserve it, but Charlie is really something special. He took a moment, and he has this wonderful ability to remind people of what truly matters. And I thought he..." With a hopeful smile, shaking his head slightly, "I just thought you both deserved something special this Christmas." Amelia looked. With her arms crossed, "Edward," she confidently stated, "we don't need anything from you." "I know you don't," he replied. Edward said quickly, his tone softer now. "But this isn't about me trying to fix things or interfere. It's simply, a dinner is a wonderful opportunity for Charlie to experience something truly magical, all thanks to Amelia." Glanced toward Charlie, who stood by Santa's sleigh display, pointing with enthusiasm at the animatronic reindeer. The sight of her son, so bright and full of joy, made her pause. She realized just how much it meant to her. Christmas held a special meaning for him, and she was determined to put in the effort to create a stable life for them, even when challenges arose. "It's just dinner," Edward repeated, his voice calm. "I promise." Amelia hesitated, studying his face as though searching for the truth behind his words. She saw glimpses of warmth and complexity that hinted at a deeper understanding. Thought of the one who had walked away from her all those years ago, yet there was something different in his eyes now reflect a sense of humility. Perhaps even a spark of hope before she could respond. Charlie came running up, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom, did you see? The reindeer are enormous." He paused in front of her, his grin beaming brightly. Turning his attention to Edward, he asked, "Are you talking about us coming over for Christmas?" Amelia blinked, and Charlie wondered how it would all come together. "Hey Charlie, you didn't let her finish. You're inviting us, right?" He turned to Edward, his voice bubbling with enthusiasm, sounding so cool. Edward smiled. "It's just a little dinner, nothing fancy." "Can we go, Mom, please?" Charlie turned his bright eyes on Amelia, tugging at her arm. "We always have the chance to go somewhere special for Christmas." "Please," Amelia sighed, her resolve wavering as she glanced back at Edward, who observed her patiently, not rushing but clearly anticipating. She turned back to Charlie, his wide, hopeful eyes conveying so much. She ultimately decided on her fine, saying she would relent, but only for dinner. Charlie hooped with excitement, nearly bouncing on the spot. "Yes, it's going to be amazing. This will be the best Christmas ever." Amelia shot Edward a look that clearly conveyed, "You owe me." He nodded, his face brightening with appreciation. "Tomorrow it is." He mentioned 6:00 the following evening, and Amelia parked her. A humble car sat at the end of Edward's long, winding driveway. Charlie gazed out the window, his eyes sparkling with wonder as he absorbed the scene. The sprawling estate that stretched out before them was beautifully blanketed in snow, creating a perfect quilt that sparkled under. The soft glow of carefully placed lights illuminates the house. No. The mansion rose. Like something out of a storybook, its tall windows glow warmly against the winter night. "Mom, are we going to a castle?" Charlie whispered, his voice brimming with excitement. And Amelia couldn't help but share in the joy. With a sense of wonder, she gripped the steering wheel, her breath gently fogging the windshield. "No, sweetheart, it's just," she trailed off, searching for the right words. "It's just so grand." The doors opened as they approached, and a warm-hearted housekeeper welcomed them, assisting Charlie with his coat while Amelia navigated the moment with a touch of shyness. As she stepped into the grand foyer, she was pleasantly surprised by Edward's world and the impressive display of his wealth. Exciting moment took a turn when Charlie gasped, prompting Amelia to turn and discover the reason behind the entire. The house had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with a massive Christmas tree standing proudly in the center of the foyer. Branches adorned with twinkling lights, sparkling glass ornaments, and golden accents. Ribbons and boughs of evergreen lined the grand staircase, intertwined with red bows and fairy lights, filling the air with a delightful scent. With a hint of pine, cinnamon, and the delightful aroma of freshly baked cookies, Charlie turned to Edward. who appeared at the top of the stairs with his hands in his pockets, observing them with a somewhat bashful expression did. Edward's lips quirked into a small smile. "It's Christmas, isn't it?" Charlie laughed and joyfully ran ahead, his small boots squeaking on the polished floors as the housekeeper offered to help. "Show him the decorations in the next room." Amelia shrugged off her coat, feeling a delightful sense of openness in her simple. Edward stepped toward her, his voice gentle. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't. I'll do this for you," Amelia replied, her tone brightening with enthusiasm. Edward nodded with a sense of understanding, and Charlie, feeling encouraged, replied softly. The evening unfolded like a dream Charlie would cherish forever. Edward had pulled out all the stops. A sled ride had been set up in the snowy back garden, complete with a team of HES and warm blankets. Charlie's face radiated happiness as he and Amelia rode through the snow, the bells on the horses jingling with every step, while inside, a warm fire crackled invitingly. A massive stone fireplace with Christmas carols playing softly in the background creates a warm and inviting atmosphere. A delightful and charming dinner was served at a long table beautifully decorated with candles and pine garlands, while Charlie filled the air with cheerful chatter. His laughter filled the spaces where silence could have felt awkward. Amelia watched him with quiet pride, but every so often, her gaze drifted to Edward, who appeared gentler tonight, radiating warmth. Over the desert, Edward turned to Amelia with a hopeful expression. "Can we talk?" he asked. She looked a bit hesitant, but after a moment, she seemed to consider it. The moment she nodded, Charlie had peacefully drifted off to sleep on the couch by the fire, his cheeks glowing pink with the warmth of the flames. Edward led Amelia to a smaller sitting room where they sat across from each other for a moment. Ed spoke. "I'm sorry." Edward spoke at last, his voice soft yet unmistakably clear for all to hear. Amelia gazed at him with her arms crossed, curious about the timing. Edward glanced down at his hands, then back at her. "Because I've spent years pursuing things that didn't truly fulfill me. And when I met Charlie, it felt like a turning point. That photograph brought back memories of what I once had and the possibilities that lie ahead." Amelia's. Her expression softened, though she remained silent. Edward paused for a moment before continuing. "You've done a fantastic job with him, Amelia. He's so kind and thoughtful. Everything I'm not." "You're wrong," she said softly. "You're here now." Edward looked at her startled expression softened as Amelia sighed, her gaze drifting toward the warm glow of the fire lights spilling in. "The people in the next room bring about change in Edward, perhaps not all at once, but they certainly do influence him." He swallowed hard, his voice breaking just slightly. "I want to be better, and not just for." Amelia gazed at him for a while, reflecting on people like him and people like you. In that moment, her expression was a mystery, but then she smiled faintly and said, "Merry Christmas." Edward smiled back, embracing the warmth of her words like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a long, dark winter. Christmas morning arrived with a gentle hush, the kind of stillness that only snow could bring. Soft light streamed in through the windows of Ed W.'s sprawling estate. Soft shadows dance across the rooms adorned in festive cheer. Filling the air with warmth and joy was filled with the delightful scent of pine cinnamon and the cozy warmth of crackling logs from the. Amelia sat cozily curled up in an armchair, a warm blanket draped over her legs. Her eyes fluttered closed as she listened to the gentle rhythm of the fire. Charlie lay sprawled on the rug, in front of the tree. With his head propped on his hands, he admired the twinkling lights. Edward stood just beyond at the threshold of the room. I watched them both for the first time in years, and the house felt alive with possibilities. Felt like it belonged to someone, not a fortress of solitude, but a warm and inviting home. "Merry Christmas," Edward said softly, stepping into the room. Charlie looked up with a smile. Immediately, his face brightened with a cheerful grin. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Edward." "Smile brightly, I have something for you." Charlie shot upright with enthusiasm. Bubbling with excitement, Edward handed him a large, carefully wrapped gift. The boy eagerly tore through the wrapping paper, his little hands eagerly fumbled until a thick leather-bound scrapbook landed in his lap, and Charlie blinked in surprise, curiously examined the cover, his mouth gradually dropping open as I flipped through the pages. The book was brimming with beautiful photographs of Amelia. Had shared tales about images of a man Charlie had never met but had always been curious about his father. Edward's team had enthusiastically gathered them overnight, diligently collecting images that beautifully illustrated the man who had cherished Charlie even before he came into the world. Each photo was thoughtfully arranged, alongside handwritten notes weaving together memories of joy, adventures, and the little moments that meant the world. Charlie's fingers gently traced a photograph of his dad sitting beside Amelia, her smile radiating warmth. With a bright smile, he whispered, "It's him." Amelia sat up, her eyes glistening with tears as she leaned in. As I got closer, I noticed Edward rubbing the back of his neck in an awkward yet endearing way. I thought to myself, Charlie could really benefit from having something to hold on to, something that reminds him of his roots, even if it's just through stories. Charlie turned, throwing his arms around Edward in a sudden, enthusiastic hug. "Thank you. It's the best Christmas ever." Edward froze for a moment, pleasantly surprised by the strength of the boy's embrace was heartwarming as he slowly returned it, his throat tight with emotion. Charlie pulled back, grinning up at him. "I always believed you could be a Christmas friend," Edward chuckled softly, ruffling Charlie's hair as Amelia wiped at her eyes, smiling through her tears. "I have something for you." "You too," Edward said, turning to her with a smile as he reached into his coat and handed her a small envelope. Amelia paused, her fingers gently grazing its surface before gently opening the flap revealed a handwritten letter on simple stationery. Amelia, I'm excited to find a way to make up for I may have lost time and caused some hurt. But I want you to know that I'm here for you and Charlie, ready to support you in any way you need. Whether as a friend or something more, I assure you I will always be here and won't disappear again. Christmas is about miracles, and it's also about second chances if I'm excited to give it a shot. Merry Christmas, Edward. Amelia looked up, her eyes sparkling with emotion for a long time. The moment either of them spoke, she beamed a gentle, forgiving smile that melted through years of distance and regret. "People really do change, don't they?" she said quietly. Edward nodded his. "Some of us are fortunate enough to have the opportunity." Amelia folded the voice rough. Let her care while holding it to her chest as she whispered, "Thank you, Charlie." Unaware of the profound feelings connecting them, he laughed joyfully as he spread the scrapbook open across the rug. "Look, Mom, this one's my favorite." Amelia and Edward exchanged a look, one filled with excitement, with understanding and hope, and perhaps even the start of something wonderful. They settled on the floor beside Charlie. The three of them nestled together as they joyfully admired the photographs by the fire. Softly crackling beside them, the snow fell gently outside the windows, creating a beautiful blanket of white. In a world of quiet stillness, the warmth of the room embraced me, gently dispelling any lingering shadows of the past. Just the gentle light of love, forgiveness, and family surrounded Edward as he sat back, observing with a warm heart. Amelia laughed as she pointed out a story in one of the photos, and Charlie beamed with joy, voice rising with excitement. For the first time in years, Edward felt something he had forgotten how to. As the snow continued to fall outside, Charlie let out a joyful sigh, leaning his head against Edward's arm. "This truly is a wonderful Christmas," he murmured sleepily, and Edward smiled, glancing at Amelia, who met his gaze with a bright spark. "Warmth, yes," Edward whispered, his voice soft. "It truly is." And for the first time in a long, long while, he truly believed it as the snow gently settles and the fire crackles warmly. Edward, Amelia, and Charlie inspire us with the power of love and forgiveness. Second chances have the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Sometimes, the most wonderful gifts are not what we expect. The ones wrapped under the tree and the ones we discover in each other when we least expect it. If you enjoyed this heartwarming Christmas tale, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you can stay updated with more delightful stories. Heartwarming stories that uplift the spirit. Share this video with someone who could use a sprinkle of holiday magic, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your favorite Christmas memory. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again. See you next time. Wishing you a Merry Christmas.